Hi everyone, this is Alex Mathers. Thank you for joining for another episode. I'm joined by Jake Desyllas, who is currently based in Brighton. I'm in London. Welcome aboard, Jake. Pleasure to have you here.
Hi, Alex.
Yeah, hi. Could you give us within a 5-minute, very quick overview of your life, I suppose, up until this point?
Sure. Well, I spent a long time in university and did a PhD, and then I developed a company, a consultancy company, and I founded it and grew it and sold that business. And when I sold the business, I worked for the company that bought my company for a few years, and then I sort of quit the rat race, I suppose you could say. And in 2010, I worked my last day on the job, and since then, I've been living job-free and doing a lot of travel. I've written books about entrepreneurship and financial independence, and I have a podcast called The Voluntary Life about these topics, about designing a life of your own choosing, in particular focusing on financial independence and the kind of freedom that gives you, how to achieve it, what you might do once you become job-free and so forth. And so that's been my focus. And as I was just saying to you before we started recording, my wife and I have been doing a lot of travel over the last 10 years, but we've now started a family. And so we're back in Brighton for the moment, and our travel lifestyle is sort of on hold. We still go away for a couple of months during the winter, but we're giving the kids a bit more of a stable base, at least in the first years, and then we're going to revisit our travel lifestyle then. So those are the kinds of things that I talk about on my podcast and in my books. And I do a lot of episodes about things like establishing a business for travel and establishing financial independence and that kind of thing. So that's really what I'm about.
Very interesting. And you've been putting out a lot of content through the podcast, The Voluntary Life. Very intriguing how dedicated you've been to that. And I'm intrigued to find out a little bit more about what's driving you to want to share so much and in so much depth and so much detail around the concepts of freedom and psychology and investing and all that kind of stuff. What's driven you to be so prolific with the podcast?
Well, as I said, I had this business, and when I sold my business, it gave me an interesting opportunity because I didn't have to work anymore. And I did work for a few years for the company that bought my business, kind of integrating it and making sure that it carried on. But it also gave me a chance to reflect on what was important to me and what did I want from life in general. And at the time I was working as a director of an international, a multinational engineering consultancy company. I was getting to travel around and so forth. And I could well have stayed in that job and earned more money and so forth. But I had the opportunity to think about, well, what is the point of earning money? What do I want from it? And what I really started to explore was the idea of living the kind of life that I wanted to live. And that doesn't necessarily mean continuing on a career path. For me, it meant deciding to live frugally on my investments from selling my business and just basically maximizing my time to do the kinds of things that I want to do, which is think about ideas that are important to me and explore how I can live each part of my life according to my own values. And that involved me thinking about what did I want from my life. And I had a huge reassessment once I sold my business of my personal relationships and of my career and everything else. And as part of that process, I started podcasting just to talk about the kinds of books that I was reading, the ideas that I was thinking about, and also to connect with other people who were designing a life of their own choosing, particularly other people who are interested in these kinds of topics like financial independence and travel and personal freedom. And so I did some interviews and read books and did some reviews and that kind of thing. And through that process, shared these ideas because they're ideas that are really meaningful to me. And I think it's so important. I think, for example, when it comes to personal freedom, I'm completely anti-politics. I'm not interested in politics at all. And part of that is because I think the most tangible kind of freedom that you can achieve in your own life is when you take responsibility for yourself, for getting the kind of freedom that you can actually achieve. And financial independence is the most important kind of freedom that you can have, because if you can afford to live from savings in a a kind of frugal and, for me, a sort of minimalist way, then you can have the opportunity to spend your life as you want. And that's the kind of freedom that I really value. And so these ideas are really meaningful to me, and I wanted to share them and connect with other people who were interested in them as well.
I certainly am drawn to the idea of financial freedom. And I think it's something that I've, in some way or another, been working towards for the last 15 years. And I very much see the lifestyle that I have as being free for the most part. I think probably less free in some ways and more free in other ways. And it's interesting that you talk about financial freedom, because that's pretty much how I got into seeing my career begin to take some form and build up some momentum. So I think I got into it through reading, as many would, The 4-Hour Workweek by Tim Ferriss. And I got really excited about the possibility of being able to create income that would be brought in as I slept. And at the tender age of 21, that sounded like a very interesting idea. And so for me, the journey into that started with kind of going back into and revisiting my interest for making art. And I started making graphics to be shared online that I would then earn royalties through. Just a sort of bright idea that came up. Just maybe I could make money by making designs and earning income through that. And that turned out to be a good move. It ended up paying the rent for me in London at one point, since sort of died down a little bit, but was able to pay the rent through the earnings from those illustrations. And it sort of put me accidentally almost into a new phase of my career. So moving away from what was going to be a real estate career into an illustration and graphic design business, because clients were finding me online and that kind of stuff. So in terms of creating that freedom through income and running my own deal and being self-employed, a very different trajectory to what I'm hearing from you, which is very much along the kind of, let's build a business, see it through to a functioning system and then selling that. Whereas I'm still in a sort of be paid by the hour type deal. There's still some money coming in passively through the illustrations and other things, but for the most part, I'm definitely in that sort of self-employed quadrant, if you want to see it that way.
Right. So, yeah, I think that's really interesting, because what you're talking about, and especially the 4-hour workweek, I know a lot of people found that to be a very appealing idea. Mm-hmm. And what's been interesting for me is thinking about the different ways of achieving a job-free life, because I noticed that, the route I took was through startup entrepreneurship. I built a business and sold it. And that is an incredibly intense experience. I thought it was a great experience and a really amazing peak experience to have. But I know that for some people, that doesn't appeal to them. And similarly, with the kind of lifestyle business and passive income approach that Tim Ferriss talks about in the 4-Hour Workweek and other people have talked about, that can be really appealing to some people. But for others, they don't get a lot of, they don't feel passionate about that idea. I mean, for me, for example, I really wanted to throw myself all in to a business that I felt very passionate about and that I felt was very meaningful to me. And a lot of the ideas behind the 4-Hour Workweek is creating a passive income generating machine. And that's sort of the goal, not so much doing a business, that you feel has a purpose and that you feel kind of invested in, not just for the money, but also for what it's doing. So what I was interested to do was to think about the different approaches that you can take, because it's not necessarily one way is going to fit for everyone. And so in my podcast and eventually in the book that I wrote, Job Free, I came up with a sort of 4 different approaches that I think some people take. There's the passive income approach that you described, which Tim Ferriss talks about in the 4-Hour Workweek. Then there's the sort of startup entrepreneurship approach, which is the way that I took, where you start something, you grow it, you get it as big as you can, you sell it. But there are other approaches too, and one that I find very interesting, which again was not my way, but is the way that a lot of people who achieve financial independence take, is the approach of extreme saving. And typically, these are people who don't work for themselves. They work for somebody else. They work in a company. Often they're people who have quite good, well-paid jobs as engineers and so forth. And what they do is they just live a super frugal life for 10 years in these high paid jobs, they effectively continue living like a student for 10 years of their career, and yet their earnings grow and grow, and they save all that money until they can get to the point where they basically live an extremely frugal life, but they are able to live without a job because they're living that frugal life. Again, it's not the way for everyone, because, you know, you have to really make some sacrifices if you want to achieve freedom that way. But it is another approach. And lastly, there's another approach, which I think in the way that you describe what you're doing is similar to, and that's the approach called unjobbing, which is a way of finding different sources of income from things that interest you. Not quite the same as the 4-hour workweek approach of just creating like a passive income machine, but it's more like finding things that you value and you enjoy doing, that you can get income from, that aren't a job, but are enough to keep you going, and that you feel like you would be doing these things anyway because you enjoy doing them. And so there are unjobbers who achieve a kind of job-free lifestyle that way too. And I find it really interesting to see that these different approaches, I think they can work for different people. And although one of them may not appeal to you, there may be another one that appeals to you. So that's why I wanted in my podcast, not just to tell everyone you should be a startup entrepreneur like me, you should build a business and sell it like I did, because for some people that just isn't going to be an enjoyable lifestyle. And starting a business for some people just seems like a lot of stress, and they don't have an idea and they can't think of a way to make it work and so forth. So for some, it might be better to choose one of these other routes. But I think it's possible to find your own path to achieving a job-free life in one of these different ways.
Yeah, interesting. So definitely relies on you being self-aware in terms of knowing what you want. And if you're looking to create financially free setup, it's interesting to know that there are different avenues you could take. So certainly have some thought on those. And as you say, there were 4 different ways of doing it that you mentioned in the book, job free. One of the other ways, I suppose, that's coming to mind, if it might be valid to add to that, would be, I don't know if you've come across Grant Cardone's sort of 10x approach to living, which is very, very much on the opposite end of the spectrum to the extreme saving approach. And just it kind of came to mind when you mentioned the saving thing, which is sort of, rather than living frugally, it's about sort of emphasizing finding what you can become really skilled at and really pushing that as far as it can go. So it could be working for someone else and becoming really skilled as an employee, or it could be becoming very skilled in a freelance profession, whatever it is, and then really maximizing that and focusing on bringing in as much income as you can. I know that many would probably not enjoy the idea of that so much as the other methods, but creating a lot of side income that comes from the excess of bringing in a lot of money and then putting all that stuff into an investment as well. And then those investments would create the passive income that you're looking for.
Yeah, I think it absolutely. The other way to go is to maximize your earnings. I think the interesting thing is whether you choose to live really frugally or whether you choose to really go for it in terms of building up earnings. I mean, in many ways, when you build a startup, that's ultimately you're trying to get a big payout. Yeah. But I think the really interesting challenge is how much is enough? And at what point are you going to step off that sort of hedonic treadmill of getting more nice stuff? Because, you know, I mean, it was an interesting challenge for me when I sold my business. Was I going to buy myself a bunch of toys, right? Which I could have done, and which could be fun. You know, it might be fun to have a yacht or something, but you've either got to decide to do those things, or you've got to decide to invest the money in the freedom that it can give you. And the interesting thing is that if you look at the empirical research, the vast majority of people who are buying luxury goods are not financially independent. They're high income, high spending. And that lifestyle is a never ending treadmill that I think, you know, you can continue to earn more and more, but if you have lifestyle inflation, then you ultimately don't get to the freedom of being able to do what you want. And it's that, I think, is the real question. I talk a little bit in my book about somebody who was a mentor to me, who I really admired, who talked to me. He was a guy who I met when I was a teenager, and he was about 5 or 6 years older than me. And he was in the process of setting up a business, and he had a plan to make $1 million and retire. And his idea was, I don't really need that much. I like reading books and thinking about ideas, and I can survive on $1 million. This was in the 90s, so $1 million was worth more then, but still he had that idea. But what I observed in him is that the more that he earned, and he did become fabulously rich, but the more that he earned, the more that idea sort of went into the background. And he became more interested in the lifestyle inflation, the things that he could get for earning more money, and the lifestyle that went with it. And in some ways, I sort of stuck to his original vision, because for me, I just wanted to get to a point where I had enough, and then find a way to change course. And I think that's the interesting thing about earning high income. I think it's great to earn high income and great to really maximize that. And certainly for some people, that's there's going to be a much more appealing approach than the kind of frugal extreme saving approach. But you still have to decide how much is enough, and what do you really want from life? What level of material wealth and material comfort, or rather, more importantly, what level of consumption do you really need to be happy? And that, I think, is a very interesting challenge, because there's so many messages pushing you to buy status symbols, which is ultimately, a lot of this stuff is purely status-based. Yeah. And so you have to decide whether or not you're going to get your sense of self-worth from how much you are able to show off your status versus the kind of freedom that it gives you to really live and do whatever you want with your day, which I think is the most important kind of freedom you can have.
I think the distinction you made that jumped out at me was the connection between self-worth and how much money you make. And I think you can get into a lot of danger if you see that there is a link between how worthy you are as a person and how much money you bring in. So if you see it that way, then the more money you make, the more self-worth you're kind of accruing through that process. And that can be a bit dodgy, because if you lose money, then effectively your own self-worth is equated with that, and you lose a sense of self. And that's probably why you see a lot of depressed bankers jumping off buildings when stocks dip, whatever. So I've been thinking a lot about that recently. Is like, how do you disconnect the two? How do you see your own self-worth as being completely independent of however much money you make? And I think that's been really helpful. It's just seeing that there is no connection, and really meditating on that idea, and then sort of with that renewed perspective, seeing money as just a means to do whatever you want with it, in a way that isn't going to affect how cool you think you are or how your status is. So I see money as just a means now to keep me on a path of focus. And I'm not fussed that it needs to be a ton, but I see bringing in more of it as being a good thing, because I'm not necessarily caring about the material side of it. I'm caring more about what I can do with that in a sort of charitable sense. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think money is a tool to buy your own freedom and to be able to live the life that you choose. It's not the end in itself.
Exactly.
And the status thing that you talk about is interesting, because it's not just money. It's also the kind of career position and status that you have to reevaluate. I mean, in my case, I had a PhD, so I was Dr. Jake Desyllas, working as a specialist in this field, well respected in this field, as a director of a multinational company. And giving that up also meant giving up the sense of like, oh, here I am, doing important things, traveling to important meetings and so forth. Yeah. And for me, I had to evaluate, like, well, what is it that I really value in life? Is this what does success really mean? And for me, it meant being able to live as I choose, not scrambling, up the corporate ladder, so to speak.
Yeah. That's an interesting thing. Like, how do you define success, and how do you define things like freedom? I guess that comes down to individual mindset and how an individual would frame it. But I suppose knowing those things is going to make all of this a lot more meaningful. It makes a lot more, there are more reasons. There's a clearer reason behind why you'd be doing any of this stuff. So if you had a different perspective on what success looked like, then you might be chasing money forever on this endless treadmill, or you might see success in an entirely different light, in which case you would be totally happy to stop, as you say, constantly looking to add more and more and more, especially in the material side of things. I wonder when, like, what was the boundary for you? Like, what was the sort of point at which you realized that you didn't need to keep accumulating stuff? Was there a clear sort of moment in time where you realized I don't need any more and this is everything I need?
Well, I think for me, because I sold a business, I got a big payout when the business was sold. I had to stick around in the company that I sold it to for a few years to kind of integrate it. And so the payout wasn't all at once, but that really gave me the question of like, well, could I live from investments if I just invested this now? Could I just be job free and not have to work anymore? And then, it wasn't so much that I could think like, oh, well, I'm going to be, rolling in riches for the rest of my life. But it meant that, if I'm frugal and if I don't, as I say, buy lots of toys, then I could potentially just live off the investment. Yeah. And that was the process that got me thinking about, well, do I want to continue working there? Do I actually want to continue in this career? And at the time I thought, no, I want to do different things with my life. I want new challenges. I want to think about ideas and write books and do other things as well. I don't want just to be stuck in this particular path because it's the path that I've been on. Mm. And I think it means you said a minute ago, you have to decide for yourself what freedom is. And I think you're absolutely right. The thing that's so important for me, or that I've found such an important process, has been to think about what my own values are and actually be critical of the assumptions that I was brought up with, the things that my parents believed and so forth, and decide for myself, okay, well, what do I actually want from life? What do I think is important? And what values do I want to hold? Because when I started out in my career, I didn't really have a lot of values. I was kind of rudderless to a certain degree. And that process of trying to be conscious of what my own values are in terms of my personal relationships, in terms of money, in terms of what I'm doing with my time, what I find meaning in, and what I think my purpose in life is, that has been a very difficult process. But ultimately, I think that's what true freedom is deciding for yourself what your values are and then living them.
Yeah. I'm interested to see, because there seems to be a different Jake either side of the creation of the business that you sold, possibly, in that it doesn't seem as if you had pre-planned what ended up being sort of living off those investments before you started the business. Do you think, for example, your values were the same and your plans were the same leading up into creating the business as they were after you sold?
Well, funnily enough, the one thing that I did have from very early on was this idea of selling the business. When I founded my business, it was in the late 90s internet boom era, when people of my generation were founding startups. In London, there were loads and loads of people founding funky internet companies and getting loads of investment. And it seemed to me like, well, if they can do it, I'm sure I can too. And so I started a business, and then there was the internet crash just right after I started. So the idea of getting venture capital went out the window, but I never sort of got off the idea that I want to build this business and ultimately one day I want to sell it. And that took a lot longer than I thought. It ended up taking me 10 years, the whole process, rather than, I envisaged it being something that might take 5 years. Yeah. So that was something that I had as an idea early on. Even if it was something that I wasn't sure was going to be possible, I still thought that would be I would definitely seize the opportunity if that would be possible at some time in the future. What changed, I think, some of the things that I wasn't that conscious of at the time, was thinking through my personal values as well, and thinking through what do I want from my personal relationships, what's important to me in terms of my personal life. And so as I went through and thought about these things, I realized that I had to kind of reevaluate a lot of the ideas that I was brought up with. So my parents never married, and they split up when I was very young. And that, for example, is something that I thought, well, if I'm going to have a family, I'm not going to take that approach. And so I'm very happily married, and we're staying together, and we're raising kids together. And this is the kind of thing that I think it took a lot of thinking about. Well, what do I think is important in life? And, one of the reasons why I thought I didn't want to continue on that kind of career path is if I did start a family, I wanted to have a chance to spend some time with my kids too. So in many other ways, I thought through a lot of things. My parents were both very political. My mother was actually a revolutionary communist when I was a kid. And so I'm very anti-political. I see the opportunity to improve the world through entrepreneurship and through personal action, not through politics. And so I did a lot of thinking about what my own values are and how I can actually live those values. And that process was one that definitely the opportunity, the freedom that came with selling my business gave me a chance to think about those things. But the idea of selling itself was one that mentor I told you about sort of planted that seed many years before. And eventually when the chance came, I jumped at it.
Intriguing. So quite interested to hear more about the process of the creation of that business that led to the sale. And I know that you talk a lot about productivity and the need to be productive as an entrepreneur to kind of keep things going. Maybe we could explore that aspect of things, because I know that this business involved bringing together a team, but I'm interested to know how you kind of stuck with it for so long, sort of mentally, physically, at the helm of a business like that. Could you bring in some insight into how you managed to make that work from start to finish? Because I know that you're a bit of a rare breed in terms of being able to commit to a project like that, see it through to completion, create the full system that it needs to be before selling it. That's quite an impressive achievement.
Well, I think the interesting thing for me was that I was totally dedicated to what my business was doing because I really believed in the purpose of the business. And I think this comes back to what we were talking about with the 4-hour work week idea. When I started the business, I didn't start it as a machine to generate income. I started it because I felt very passionately about the poor quality of environments for pedestrians and how badly street networks and shopping centers and other places are designed for pedestrians. And so my business was, we did computer simulation and modeling of pedestrian flows. And our job as a consultancy was to help people create better spaces for people to walk around in by understanding what pedestrians do and how pedestrians navigate, and creating environments that work better, streets that work better and shopping centers that work better and so forth. So one of the things that I think is really important if you're going to do a startup is you have to actually be passionate about what it is that you're doing, because it's so hard and you encounter so many failures and so many barriers that unless, at least this is my take on it, unless you really believe in what you're doing, it's very hard to keep going. That's what kept me going, was that I really believed in what we were doing. And then in the process of starting a business, I was also able to take interest in the problem of creating a business itself as a problem. When we started, I was just interested in, the ideas about pedestrian movement and so forth. And in the first couple of years, it was so hard to make money that I had to take a look at myself and think like, well, what am I doing and what am I not doing right? And in many things that were uncomfortable for me because they weren't really in my background and weren't necessarily in my character, I had to learn how to do. Most importantly was selling. I had to really understand how to sell and take it seriously and treat it as a problem to be solved rather than, a kind of chore that I was doing for the sake of it. I had to take it on with enthusiasm as something to learn about and understand and treat it like a really interesting problem to solve. And so I managed to take the approach of treating the business side itself as an interesting problem too. And when you do that, I think it is super fascinating understanding what works in business, what doesn't work in business, setting up management systems, working out how to work as a team, working out how people tick and how you can, motivate people and incentivize people and so forth. So these problems, I think as an entrepreneur, you can actually get a huge amount of fulfillment if you're willing to take them on as challenges rather than as kind of things that you also have to do, if you like. Yeah. And that's what kept me going. And the interesting thing is that one of the reasons that I eventually sold the business was because my passion for the business, for pedestrian movement and so forth, I was getting to the point where I was actually starting to get interested in other things, and I didn't feel quite so passionately about it. And that's one of the reasons why I did actually sell. So I think other people have different approaches to business. And I know some people are able to keep themselves going purely on the intellectual challenge of making money and of treating it like a machine. For me, it was more than that. It was also about feeling like we were doing something important and something that I believed in. So that even if my business hadn't succeeded financially, it still felt like we were doing something that mattered, and that I felt like this is a good use of my time. And I think if you can create a business like that, then that gives you the passion to keep going. But then if on top of that, you can take on the intellectual challenge of treating it as a business and having discipline in the approach that you take to the business, so that you're doing the things that make money and you're understanding what your customers want and all of those other things too, then if you can pair those two things together, that's how you get to make something that really succeeds.
I think there's a lot of useful stuff that we could take from that, especially for my listeners. I think are mainly entrepreneurs, freelancers, a lot of artists, a lot of creatives, and I see a lot of people who follow me find it very easy to work on the stuff that they love to do, whether that be making art, designs, working on a business that's going to solve problems. And that's key, being interested, obviously, in the focal point of the work and the problems that it's solving and the passion around that, and knowing that you're involved in making a difference and solving those issues and creating solutions. I think that's sort of one aspect, but I think a lot of people fall short by thinking that the business is going to be just about that. It's about doing what you love, following your passion. And I've seen a lot of people really struggling with an approach that limits themselves to simply the passion, the love side of things, because I think it gives the false impression that everything is going to be fun in a business, and it should be fun. And if you don't find it fun, and if you experience pain, you're going to stop and you're going to give up. And then so bringing in the idea of seeing the full business as a craft in and of itself. So it's, there's the passion aspect of it, the stuff that's interesting, but then there's also the other stuff that might be less, at least initially, interesting to the business owner. But I think it really helps to see, as you say, the things that are less easy to get motivated about as opportunities for growth, as a challenge, and as a sort of craft that can be developed in itself, especially sales, especially the ugly sounding idea of selling stuff. Because if you're in business for anything, you've got to be able to sell stuff.
Absolutely. And I think this is the really important thing, especially if your audiences, a lot of them are artists and so forth, because then I'm sure, like me, they don't want to do sales. That was my approach initially. Yeah. I was far more interested in getting software developed and interesting intellectual challenges like that than I was in doing sales. And the thing is, it's not because it's boring. I think it's the more important thing that you have to face is that it is emotionally challenging. And that is actually an incredible growth opportunity. This is one of the reasons why I think starting a business is a peak experience. And it can be, if you take it seriously, then you are forced to face your own limitations and your own character deficiencies. And for example, selling is one where you face an enormous amount of rejection and you face an enormous amount of failure. And that is psychologically an incredible challenge. And so it's very easy to avoid it because it makes you feel uncomfortable. But if you're willing to take it on and think like, how can I actually approach this in a way that I am going to find fulfilling? And how can I do this in a way that I feel like I'm actually getting a growth experience out of this? Then it can be an amazing experience. I mean, for me, the way that I approached it was very much, and this is because this is the way that I think, I treated it all as something that to create systems about, because for me that depersonalized the rejection aspect of selling. If you can get really good information and get systems going where you can see like, okay, what's the proportion of successes that I have in this branch of industry versus that branch of industry, with this type of sales approach versus that type of sales approach, with direct selling versus affiliate relationships versus partnering and so forth. Then you can start to see like, okay, yes, I didn't sell anything here, but I sold more there. Why did I sell more there? And that becomes an interesting process that you think about. You can think about like, how can I actually improve on this? And for me, that meant that the rejection side of it became much less significant. It's just part of the whole system. Any individual sale that doesn't go through is much less significant. And that's the way that I was able to turn this into something that I could find fulfilling. It was sort of almost gamifying it for myself. Other people will have different approaches, but I think the main thing is it will force you to confront your weaknesses doing a business. And if you're able to take on that as an exciting challenge that you can grow and learn through, then you can face up to it and create something that really works, and that you actually do get fulfillment from the business side of it as well. Mm-hmm. Whereas if you treat the business side as an unfortunate chore getting in the way of the bit that you love, then it will never work, because you'll never actually be forced to do the things that you have to do. For me, it was a situation where we started out, I invested a huge amount of money. I took out massive personal loans. I was 150 grand in debt in the beginning of my business. And after almost a year and a half, we had a very big project, and then we had no work. And I had to let some people go. And I thought, what the hell am I going to do? I've got this huge debt. We haven't got any work coming in. And it forced me to change my approach. And I was able to get some good advice from somebody a friend of mine who was actually a management consultant, who basically showed me what I wasn't doing and what I needed to do. But then most importantly, I was willing to actually bite the bullet and do the uncomfortable things that needed doing. Yeah. And I found that to be, in the end, one of the most exciting things about the business was actually becoming an entrepreneur.
Yes. Well, there's nothing quite like a bit of financial pressure to push you into, getting your act together and facing up to things that feel risky and things that feel uncomfortable and vulnerable and could end up in rejection. So I had a similar story in terms of feeling the financial pinch back in 2014. I was living in Vietnam, and I had done pretty well the year prior to that in my design business, and found myself with a surprising tax bill that came through, and I had to find a way to make about 10 grand in a couple of weeks, which was a bit of a surprise for someone who was happily working away at illustrations. But that really pushed me into getting serious about figuring out a way to sort of take on that sense of vulnerability and sort of start asking for money more brazenly. And I moved into business consulting at that point, which I hadn't done before. But I realized that would have to happen in terms of making use of the skills that I had at that point. And that involved just really stepping up and getting in front of people and having conversations with them that would end up in a sale or not sale. But that was a very full-on, quite intense experience for someone who'd spent most of his time behind a screen, hiding away from any social interaction and any sense of social risk. And as soon as I did that, and obviously I experienced a bit of rejection, but I came out of that with such a sense of growth, as well as the gains that came through stepping up and taking the risk, and the rewards that came through those risks. That taught me a lot, that phase of making that money back quickly through taking courage. And I think you're right. It's so key to have the right mindset with all this, and to see the potential to be rejected as not the potential to be rejected, but the potential to gain new information and to stretch yourself and to absorb new things that are going to build your own value.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So yeah, really interesting stuff about rejection, because that's the thing that stops a lot of people from being able to do more, to experience their own full potential, but also to grow their own businesses and to see really the freedom that you've been talking about has a lot to do with that. And I think most of the lack of freedom that people experience comes out of psychological imprisonment.
Oh, definitely. I think the people, when people talk about wanting to start a business but not starting, a lot of them talk about not having an idea yet. But I think actually the biggest thing that holds people back is the fear of being rejected.
Yeah.
That's what stops people from starting. By the way, as always, when I podcast, there's a bunch of guys unloading something outside. So if you hear some banging, then that's what's going on.
No worries. Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. Like it's such a strong, it can be such a strong psychological block, and it's so silly, really, when it's really, ultimately it's just a thought in your head. It's not that you're going to experience lower self-esteem by being rejected. And the reason I'm talking about this is because I recently discovered I don't know if you've heard about the 3 principles, which is a philosophy espoused by a guy called Sid Banks, a Scottish philosopher, I think. And he talks about...
I haven't heard of that.
No, it's interesting. It's an interesting way of taking off a lot of the pressure that we create in life by seeing outside circumstance, whether that be someone saying no to you, or someone rejecting you, or you being in debt, or whatever it is that happens outside of your reality, or in your circumstances, and seeing that there is no connection between that and who you are, how you react, how you experience life, because ultimately everything we experience is the thinking. It's how we think. So just seeing that distinction, seeing that actually everything that we experience is in our thinking. And you might disagree with that. I know that you're into objectivism and that kind of stuff as well. So I don't know if that kind of contradicts it, but it's really helped me personally to see how, if I get nervous about something, or if I get anxious around something, I know that I'm just anxious as a response to the ideas I have in my head, the visions I have in my head. So if you can just basically turn down your incessant thinking, you'll find things a lot easier.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I'm not an objectivist myself. I did a podcast about going to an objectivist meetup, which I found very interesting, and I certainly find a lot of their ideas interesting. In general, though, I'm always interested in ideas and philosophies that help you take responsibility for your own life and give you as much locus of control as possible. Yeah. And so I'm very appreciative of approaches where you focus on the things that you can do. And for example, changing your mindset, changing your ideas are things that are in your control. That's what I think. I mean, that's the only thing that it's worth focusing on. This is sort of some of the things that I appreciate about Stoicism are around these ideas as well, just focusing on the things that you can actually control. That's why I'm not interested in politics, because I'm interested in things that I can affect change in. And my society starts with the people that I interact with and that I actually encounter and that I can make an impact on. That's where I think I make a difference in this world. And ultimately, that's all we can do, is to actually be as positive a force within our own relationships and in the world that we find ourselves. And so I'm very into taking responsibility for your own life, and you have to if you want to achieve freedom. That's another thing that holds people back, is the mindset of thinking about the world being something out there that you are a product of. Yeah. Rather than thinking in terms of, what can you actually change? What can you do yourself that you are in control of to change things for yourself?
Yeah, it's very much the difference between creativity and reactivity. I've talked about this a lot. If you really want to boil things down to a very simple way of visualizing the ideal way to be in the world, it's about creating your reality and knowing that you have full responsibility and doing what you you can do to create that reality, rather than reacting to everything that's happening around you. And I think it's very easy, very human, to get into the state of, oh no, life is happening to me and it's making me depressed and it's so difficult, blah blah blah. And it's really helped to be able to identify when that's happening, and B, to know that you can then just move into creating again and saying, well, what can I learn from this? How can I use this as an opportunity to grow and to stretch? And that's huge. If you can really absorb that idea, building things like businesses and becoming an entrepreneur and being independent and being totally free is going to be a lot easier.
Definitely, yeah. Yeah, as I said, I'm always interested in those kind of approaches, and I think one of the things that really is difficult for people in thinking about things like starting a business is that when you spend years and years in school, you are effectively getting trained to be an employee and to think about other people being responsible for running businesses and managing the world, and you being just a cog in the machine. Whereas if you think about it in terms of, if you treat life as an entrepreneur, then you're thinking in terms of what you can create and what you can go out and build, rather than where you can find a job with somebody else.
It takes quite a contrarian view and quite a sense of resistance to how things are supposed to be, because we're, as you say, we're so socially programmed in so many different ways. And I've been seeing this come to the fore more and more over the years. The more you question things, the more you can sort of be able to step outside of things and see and ask, is this really the way things should be, or is this really the way things are supposed to be? I think it's definitely healthy to question a lot of the things that we hold as the way things should be done, in quotes. And I think, as many entrepreneurs will identify with, there is certainly a sense of going against the grain, in that a lot of the work and a lot of the commitment around entrepreneurship is going to feel like you are taking a very contrarian, very against the grain approach, and that takes quite a lot of courage, I'd say, and the healthy mindset that we were talking about as well.
Yeah, I wish it wasn't that way. I don't want to be a contrarian for the sake of it, And sometimes especially when I think about all the choices that I make, which in some ways I am making eccentric choices compared to the mainstream of life, and I kind of think to myself, well, it forces you to really challenge yourself as to whether or not you're right when you think in ways that are contrary to so many other people. And I find it hard. I'd much rather that, mainstream ideas were all going to work for me. I wish I didn't have to be such a contrarian in lots of ways, because I find it difficult being contrarian, but ultimately that's one of the things that you have to do if you want to live a life of your own choosing. And it's painful to go against sort of the grain of what many people choose to do with their lives, but ultimately the benefits are worth it.
Yeah. Do you think you'd have less of a sense of freedom, though, if there wasn't this underlying sort of the mainstream approach to things, and very much a sense, unfortunately, that a lot of people are stuck in certain ways and certain ways of thinking, and also just sort of not free in many of the ways? I think I also read the book by Harry Brown, so the things that he espouses in that also worth a read. Do you think that
How I Found Freedom in an Unfree World?
Yeah, that one. Yeah. So I think the fact that the world is still pretty unfree in many ways, the sense of freedom that you get from stepping out of that is probably a little bit more profound. Do you agree with that?
Oh, definitely. Yeah. Again, I wish it wasn't. I wish the world in general was freer. I don't see why a vastly larger number of people shouldn't be able to achieve financial freedom, and shouldn't be able to have their own businesses and work for themselves, and take some time, away from work, given the opportunities that I think exist to do that. But so I wish it wasn't that way, but certainly it does. When you're able to achieve the kind of freedom that you can, seeing that a lot of people don't. For example, we talked earlier on about people who are high income and yet who are just suffering under enormous amount of credit card debt and lack of financial freedom because of the lifestyle choices that they've made. That when I see that, it makes me feel even more free in living debt free and and being able to do what I want with my day. But I wish it wasn't that way. I think a lot of people, unfortunately, this again is we were talking about personal responsibility. This is a matter of taking responsibility for the things that you can actually do and doing them, and not blaming the world around you for the things that were your own choices.
Yeah. Well, we live in a world where we haven't got that many things that are holding us back physically, in the sort of concrete terms. It's mostly, from what I see, a lack of freedom in the psychological sense. And I don't know, I wonder whether the people who are holding themselves back in many ways actually are quite satisfied in that position, or whether if they could only be told by someone how things could be, that they might change. But I get the sense that a lot of people are not actually willing to experience, things like the long-term travel, living abroad, and having that financial freedom. I don't know, maybe people kind of sadistically want to have that struggle.
Yeah, it's an interesting one, because I think a lot of things that you would hope, if people were educated there about ideas, then they would change their approach. But there's a nice quote that I like from an entrepreneur called Jake Desyllas, which is, he said, "The reason that I don't have a six-pack is not from lack of information." It's not the reason that you don't have perfect abs. It's not because you lack the information, right? We all know how to get perfect abs. It's because it's right, exactly. It's not a lack of information. And so I think that's the interesting thing about it. And that, I think that's a very true statement when it comes to many things in life. That it's not necessarily that you can't find out how to live more differently, but that it is psychologically and emotionally challenging to actually confront some of the fallacies that you might have been brought up with in your family, in school and so forth, and really decide things for yourself.
Do you think it takes a certain personality type to be the sort that goes into entrepreneurship and does the digital nomad thing? I get the sense that it might be that there's something in the DNA aspect of it. Do you think that's true?
I wonder about that. I really do. I don't know. I don't think, I think certainly I've met many different types of entrepreneur. And there are very much entrepreneurs who lead from the front, and entrepreneurs who are more like the mastermind in the background. And I also think, like we were talking about before, that depending on your personality type, you might achieve a job-free life in different ways. Like certainly some personalities will be much more attuned towards sort of extreme saving approach, and others will be more interested in the kind of startup entrepreneurship that I did. So I don't know, but it's interesting to me that, I think it's an interesting question to ask of oneself, like how much of the things that I have done with my life were ultimately there from the beginning in terms of my personality, and how much of them are in terms of the ideas that I have. One thing I will say is that I think it's very tempting to take a kind of, especially if you're interested in science and you're interested in sort of scientific method, it's very interesting to imagine ourselves as being determined by our DNA and circumstance. And that ultimately, I think, is a very self-defeating philosophy, because it takes away your agency and the power that you have to actually choose things for yourself. One of the things, the most exciting thing about being human and being alive is the fact that you do have the ability to choose for yourself, to think for yourself about what you want from life, and to change your mind and learn from your mistakes and your experiences. So I'm sure that many of the things that are important in life and that have been important in my life have been a part of me from my DNA onwards. But I think it's clear, empirically clear, that you can change your life. You can change course. And that's the side of life, I think, that you have to really focus on if you want to do so. Otherwise, you become a self-fulfilling prophecy, Otherwise, if you don't believe that you have the chance to change your life, you won't.
Yeah. Yeah, that's the big thing, isn't it? It's just how we think of ourselves in our own world. It's key that we are able to see a crack in the, on the horizon and sort of step through that if we find ourselves being trapped in that way. I think it's key to have that self-awareness. And yes, I agree with you. I think the DNA sort of argument in terms of that determining who you're going to be through the scope of your life is, I think, very, very minimal compared to the nurture aspects of that, and the things that you pick up as you go through life, and the opportunities that are there. I think anyone has the capacity to change, and I think some people might have more of a challenge on their hands, because of the fact that they just don't see it. They don't see that there is an ability to change. And so there's a lot of heaviness around the boundaries that a lot of people will impose on themselves.
Yeah. And I think, and also it can become an interesting excuse too. I mean, when I started writing about financial independence, I got some interesting pushback, especially from high income people. I remember one of the comments that I got was from a guy, I believe he worked at Google. So he's obviously quite high income because it's a really good job.
Yeah.
And he was saying, "Oh, financial independence, it's impossible. You can't, nobody can ever achieve this." And I was thinking to myself, this is so interesting coming from someone who works at Google. Like, of all the people who could, this is one of the people who definitely could achieve it. And yet he's pushing back. And I think the reason for that is that if you are set on a course, let's say, for example, this guy, and this is all just me imagining things, I don't know what's true or not. Let's say that he got into his lifestyle at Google, spending money and living a comfortable life and generally enjoying the lifestyle that you can get if you have a really good job like that. Then he reads something about being super frugal and saving for financial independence. And that's a challenge because, reading about other people doing that, it's sort of, you can read it as a criticism of your own lifestyle. If you want to, you can think like, okay, well, if they're doing it and I'm not, what's wrong with me? And why haven't I been more disciplined in my saving and so forth? And so you can get a lot of pushback from people who don't want to hear this kind of ideas because they hear it as a challenge.
Yeah. I've seen plenty of that. And I think you're right. I think it's about people making a decision for themselves and wanting to make sure in everything that they see around them is confirmation that they've made the right decision. And so I guess the ego is at play in that regard. People want to know that they're doing the right thing. And if there's something that goes against it and might suggest indirectly that they've made possibly the wrong decision or not quite the right decision for them, then they're going to resist against that. So I suppose that brings into play the idea of being clear on the decisions you make and I guess the mindset you bring to it and being open to, challenging yourself.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. And I think you have to get into that kind of approach where challenging yourself becomes almost a way of life. Yeah. Otherwise it's just like being fit, you sort of just have to keep at it. Otherwise, you will, the path of least resistance will get you.
Right. Yeah. I suppose if there's anything as we close off to really take from this conversation, I think it's the idea of continually being open to, being willing to challenge yourself and to continually grow. Because if you close off that trajectory with everything that you do, then you're gonna be stuck. And I think that's the worst kind of lack of freedom to have, is not growing, being static, and being closed to the potential to change.
Yeah, I think, as you said, when I think about your audience, and you mentioned sort of artists and so starting business and stuff, I think something to leave with is, if you're going to do this, then try and treat all of these things as an extreme personal development challenge, and try and take pleasure as much as you can. I mean, it's a weird kind of pleasure because it's painful, but try and get fulfillment, I think is probably a better word, from the process of challenging yourself to overcome some of the barriers that you have, whether it's around selling or challenging the values that you're brought up with, so that you can create the life of your own choosing.
Yeah, love it. Totally agree with that. I think it's all about that mindset of being open to change, being open to continually challenging yourself, and seeing pain as you know, it's just something that happens as part of the whole package of what you're doing, and see a way to enjoy every part of it. And there will be ways. I mean, pain doesn't mean that you need to move away from those things. It means that it's an area that has potential for a bit more growth and a bit more stretching. And through all that, that's where you will grow that value, and you'll be of use to the world, and you'll have much more freedom that way. So yeah, love it.
Absolutely.
So I appreciate the conversation, Jake. Learned a lot there, gained a huge amount, and really fascinating to hear your story. So I appreciate that.
Thanks very much for having me on.
No worries. Where can we hear more about you and follow you, and where can we get your books, for example?
Best place to go is thevoluntarylife.com, and you'll find links to my books on there. And they're on Amazon as paperback and ebook and audiobook and Audible as well. So yeah, but thevoluntarylife.com is probably a good place to start.
Fantastic. Thank you, Jake.